that far. It just seems that he spends a lot of words to really try and clarify a thing with utmost precision, and sometimes that loses way for clarity. So the main book we'll base it on is Phenomenology of Spirit. But I'll just go through some basic facts here of Hegel. First, give you a little bit of an introduction for him. I should probably start the time as well. So we're going to be about 20 minutes to half an hour. And then after that, I'm going to open up for a couple of questions, comments, and the like, if people want to come with that. And then I'm going to divide you out into various groups, and we can do a bit of our own dialectic thinking. And I'm going to force you guys to try and put on the Hegelian hat and engage in some dialectic discussions yourself. So you see the red piece of paper, the blue piece of paper, and the green ones. The idea is that we spread out to discuss some of these questions I've put in, some of the themes and topics that Hegel would be grappling with. And the idea is that the bit that's not cursive, the regular text, is the thesis, and we imagine it's almost the thesis that Hegel could be putting forward. So if you largely agree with the thesis, you can pick a blue slip and write a little paragraph or a little sentence on it clarifying your position, because you don't have to agree with it 100%, but you have to largely agree with it over the antithesis. The antithesis is going to be the cursive part, so that's going to be sort of an opposing view. That's going to be the red here. So if you largely more agree with the opposing view, the cursive view, you pick a red slip and you write down a little clarification of it there. And then hopefully when the group discusses, we've got the thesis clashing against the antithesis, and what should we arrive at? A synthesis. We should arrive at a culmination of the two opposing sides, not necessarily one side just winning over the other, but coming to a new, more satisfactory answer out of the two opposing sides meeting each other, and hopefully something the group can agree on. That's going to be a bit of an interesting social experiment for me as well, and see if it can actually be done. We'll find out. So that's the idea. So just to give you a sort of hands-on experience with one of his main methods, and really the way that he quite often conceives of the world, and his perspective on the world, if you will, is also quite dialectical. But we'll get into that. Now, first of all, I'm just going to give you a few basic facts on our good friend Hegel. I'm also going to mention briefly what we've thought about before. We've covered a couple of philosophers before him. We've covered René Descartes, who's often claimed to be the father of modern philosophy. So we've really started with him and had a focus on what is considered modern philosophy, going from him to David Hume, and a lot of Hume's responses on him, which was very much more of an empiricist's response to his very rational ideas. There's been a bit of a theme of rationalism versus empiricism. And it kind of fits in well, because you could take someone like Kant and Hegel, who were trying to, well, at least reconcile them more. I'd say Kant was trying to do that, but the way Kant was trying to do it was to make a clear line and sort of save metaphysics and philosophy from Newtonian mechanics, from Newtonian physics, which was very convincing. And Kant could see, oh boy, philosophy is going to have a hard time competing with this, so I'm going to make a clear dividing line and put philosophy and metaphysical ideas and the world of ideas over in this realm, and empiricism and science and experience over in this realm. And they are two separate realms, so we have two different domains, right? So that was his way of trying to solve that problem. What Hegel's project is going to be is going to partly be to try and bridge those two worlds more, and try and crumble a bit of that wall that Kant had imposed. Because he found as a student, and back when he was a student in Stuttgart, that's the one city I remember he was in, he's a German philosopher. I might as well make that clear for those of you that don't know. He's a German philosopher. Prussian. So a proper Prussian philosopher. He's considered part of the continental philosophy, if you will, and fairly adjacent to their ilk. Now, what was I getting into there? Basically, his response is trying to bridge the divide a little bit, try and unite these worlds more, because what he found was quite often that Kantian students could become a bit orthodox and a bit reclusive from the world.
said that a bit facetiously, but he basically believed that the world soul of the Geist, which we'll get into, was expressing itself particularly through Napoleon, because Napoleon had the force of will to shape the world in his own image and break up with the old world ruled over by old bygone monarchies and religious institutions that were falling apart and becoming too old-fashioned for the new world. So there's a little bit of historical context there. I will also preface this by saying I'm not a Hegel expert, not a Hegelian as well. If there are any Hegelians here, I'm sure you'll find things that are that's not right. I can imagine that. So do forgive me. I'm just going to give you a bit of a cursory view of him. Besides, the amount of time we have and the setting we have is not conducive to try and get really in depth with him, because he's I dare say, a deep guy. Yeah, so his works are dense, and it requires you to fully understand and fully comprehend them. It takes a lot of time. You have to do a lot of tarrying, as he calls it. You have to stick around a lot and not be, just give me the quick details and I can move on, right? You actually have to grapple with it much in the same way that he was grappling with many things. That was his point of view. And there's a great little paraphrase of him. I'm paraphrasing it, not using the exact quote. But basically distilling it down to saying something along the lines of, to judge is easy, to comprehend is infinitely harder. And I think that kind of resonated with me, because it's very easy to judge something, put something in a box, especially something that you don't understand, because then it's dealt with. It's much harder work to try and understand it, especially with a philosopher of this caliber. And then, after understanding it, to then judge it, that is the hardest of all. Right? That is extremely hard. That's why people, they spend their lives doing it easily. So just delineating the borders here a little bit. Right? I am pretty limited, but I'll give you the best I can. Also, I'm also gonna, because there's a lot he covers, he's trying to explain the whole world, nothing less. I mean, you've got to give the man credit. He's a mountain climber in philosophy, right? He's certainly got high ambitions, and many people would say, as far as I gather in the academic world, that at many points he ultimately failed, right? But there's still something to be said for that ambition and being willing to try and actually make sense of the whole world and the whole of history, the whole of all the sciences, and put it into one, right? That's certainly a worthy goal. So I'm going to focus mostly on his treatment of history, just to make the borders clear. Mostly on his treatment of history, a little bit of reference back to Kant, so one of the questions we got on Disabled is about Kant as well, and a bit on religion too, because I think that's pretty important and that meshes quite well with history, and also on intuition, feeling versus thinking, of which Hegel was pretty skeptical of intuition and feeling. He's actually kind of dividing people up into two camps, and I heard just today I actually got a good contemporary analogy. You quite often hear people say, oh, I'm more, what is it? I'm more left side brain rather than right side brain, right? That's something people say all the time. You can actually compare that to some of the people he was talking about, people who had more of a holistic view, people who were more like, this is the great idea, and the details, I don't care too much about the details. And then obviously conversely, the detail-oriented people who could dig themselves down into a hole of detail as like, I know this little thing, this tiny thing really well, but if you ask them, but how does it fit in with the whole? Like, I don't know. They don't even quite themselves. The obvious analogy or metaphor is a scientist who's so deep in his own topic that he can only see the world through the lens of that topic, right? You can imagine a physicist who's seeing everything as a manifestation of physics and is sort of tunnel vision in on that. So he does, there are few things that he says that resonate with today that I think we can sort of recognize today. And I think I put that question over there about intuition, feeling versus thinking. And he sounds particularly scathing of the feeling and intuition approach. He's very much in the camp of reasoning and rationale is the way forward. So that's pretty clear. He's what would be called, he's been classified as an absolute idealist, or as a proponent of absolute idealism. And that is definitely more in the realm of ideas and almost seeing the world as a reflection of
ideas rather than a case for empiricism or this world sort of philosophy, which Hume would be more of a proponent for. But then again, it's not quite as simple as that, because when you dig deeper down, you see there are some things that they will assent to quite a lot, the philosophers. So even trying to divide them up into those camps can be a bit difficult, especially because Hegel was trying to put those two worlds together. Right? He was trying to align those two worlds and actually make the inward world. And that's another little good general thing about philosophy, I find. There's a good way of thinking about a lot of philosophy if you want to distill it down. A lot of philosophers are focusing more inward. We could take the existentialists as an example there, right? It becomes very easily a lot of navel-gazing, a lot of me, and the subject, but the outside world, can't really say much about that. And then you got the converse philosophers who's all about the outside world, but if they turn their eye inward, it becomes a bit more nebulous what they have to say, right? So his project was kind of like trying to align those two camps and actually be able to have a bridge between them and say, well, this is how the inward world interacts with the outward world. And that is something I'll get a little bit into here. Right, okay, and what else did I want to cover with you? Quick mention of Tyler's Phenomenology of Spirit, that was written in 1807. Some of the other major works is The Science of Logic, 1812, 1816, Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and The Philosophy of Right, much later on. So that was his main period of most famous works, at least from 1807 to 1821. And that is right at the culmination of Napoleonic Wars. So that gives you a good historical context. Now, moving on, because I am running out of time already. I'm gonna introduce you a little bit to one of his main methods, which is the dialectic method. Dialectics is a way of seeing it's not just a method for him, it's also a way of seeing the world, and as we'll see, it's a way of seeing history, right? So he starts to see almost everything as having within it the negation already, right? And this is where I get out into deep waters in a little bit, because it almost sounds neo-mystical to me sometimes when you get into the thick of it, but the idea, as I understand it, is that when you have something presenting itself, it's almost presenting itself as a thesis, like here is this thing, and then it will encounter an antithesis, and you can see it in history, you can see it in ideas that's put forward, you can see it even in religion. So if you just focus on history, you could say, well, you could as one example say, here's the thesis of the monarchy, and the monarchy has the divine right to rule, and that thesis has been around for quite a long while. Suddenly it encounters an antithesis, and the great example we can use here that was very relevant for him was the French Revolution. You could see the French Revolution almost as an antithesis to royalty and monarchs, right? And then out of that, out of this whole bloody rebellion, out of all this conflict, you then finally get a synthesis, you get a fairer, more democratic society at the end, and that would be sort of the synthesis of the two worlds, the old world meeting the new world, culminating in a third world, right? And it's an ever-growing spiral, so each new synthesis of, let's say, historical movements, just focusing on that, births a new thesis. And then that thesis encounters an antithesis, and then they create a third situation, or a third movement, if we're just focusing on that. So that is very much how he sees the whole world, and also when it comes into history, and here's a very important thing from history, because he doesn't just see history as a set of random events, he sees it as a gradual growth of the human spirit, of Geist. Now here is where it might be relevant to put in the dimension of religion, because he was quite religious, actually, and he was I wouldn't say orthodox, but he was certainly a fairly faithful Christian. So there's a bit of that search for meaning that comes through on that. But what he didn't like about, he was studying theology as well, what he didn't like about religion was its tendency to become orthodox and unthinking and unreasonable. So he wanted to, again, also bridge that divide, right? So for him, it was a way of translating, if you will, godhood or divinity as actually expressed through the human spirit, and the human spirit is developing through the evolution of history, you might say. So each event in history culminates and continues making gradual growth. And in that way, you can compare the whole of humanity into one person. So there's a bit of an analogy there of the whole of humanity is like one person growing up, gradually it's a messy affair, going through conflicts, going through hardships, going through failures, but eventually through all those encounters, through all those clashes, developing more and more and more and more, and becoming more and more of a, let's say, cultured person, or let's say more of a mature person, right? So in a way, he sees human history as an act of maturation for the human species, if you will, right? Of course, that view can be opposed, and have been opposed by quite a few people, but it's a way of trying to make sense of all of history. Even the worst events of history sort of have their place there, right? And that's perhaps also what is faced some criticism on, because then you start, well, some people would say at least, that then you start being able to legitimize the most horrific acts in history as a necessary part of the evolutionary stage, right? But that question should be, let me see if here. I think that's where that question is. So that's some of the general views of history. He calls the human spirit, that's why the book is called The Phenomenology of Spirit, but the German word is Geist, and Geist is close to spirit but slightly different. So it could also be translated as mind. That's the idea. There's a bit of element of both mind and spirit in that term. There's also a few other things that can be associated with that term, such as the gist of something, or the essence of something, if you will, and a sense of a geyser, almost like a geyser of human consciousness. So the Geist is really the whole of the spirit of humanity that's marching through history. It's the thing that you can't really put your finger on. It's like saying when you got a whirlpool of water, right? Does the whirlpool exist, or is it, is it just water moving in a particular way? In that sense, Geist is the same thing. It's sort of a motion, or it's sort of an event or something that transpires that's really hard to put your finger on and grasp. But once we grasp it, that's when we'll get absolute knowing and become divine. That's the idea. So that's where the religious part comes in, right? So he actually has this belief that there is a path to divinity for humanity. And the way to God is not through the afterlife and just dying and going up to him as a separate soul and being separate from the rest of the world. The way to God is through humanity and the march of history and the march of, say, religion, and refining that more and more. So it's a very human-centric philosophy that's very typical of the Enlightenment, because at the Enlightenment you get more and more of an emphasis on humanity as the central agent rather than God. And if you were any of the hardcore fundamentalists or very religious people, you'd start to say that humanity has got a bit of a streak of hubristic notions now. Humanity is thinking itself better than God. That's how some would see the Enlightenment, right? There's a hubris there, we're coming too close to the sun sort of thing. Which some people probably would still say today, right? But it's just explaining sort of some of the context he's in, and he's trying to make philosophy keep up with the times at the same time here. Now, going back to the dialectic method. So it goes back to Platonicism, it goes back to the Socratic dialogues. It stems from the word of dialogue, and in Plato's case, it's more of a exchange of our ideas and rejection of ideas until you get to something that could be true. But quite often it gets a bit disappointing. We don't necessarily get the answer. We don't necessarily get a answer. That's much later on in a lot of Plato's work that we start getting some definite answers from the man himself. But in the beginning, it's quite often just a rejection of ideas. It's like, we know all of this is not true. So the way that Hegel refined the dialectics is to not just reject the thesis, but actually transform it into something new, right? And take the not having as a sort of, well, either this side wins or that side wins, and whichever side wins we should believe is true. You take the best parts of both sides and you try and merge them into a new idea. So that's the dialectic method, and it can be a very healthy method, especially with people you disagree with, because sometimes you might actually be able to find something in what they say that could mature, well, that's at least Hegel's idea, further refine your own opinions, is the notion here. So, also, I was mentioning the holistic notions of the world versus the very particular. So he wanted philosophy to become a holistic science, which is a tall order, because suddenly philosophy is meant to be able to tell you about how everything works, really, when you distill it down. And that, some would say, was too ambitious, or at least he couldn't get there. And some even criticize him very harshly as a bit of a megalomaniac, that he thought that he was the culmination of history and it had landed on his desk and he was describing the Geist and no one else had done it before him and it all led up to him, sort of thing. Now, I don't think that's necessarily fair, because he's more seeing it, or the way he seems to describe himself, it's a continual, eternal development sort of thing. So I think he would probably still see himself as another cog or another stepping stone in history, but an important one, right? But still quite an important one. Now, let's just go for, let's see. Yes, he had faith in reason, and he believed almost that the spirit of humanity, or the Geist of humanity, was a candle of God, or was an expression of the Holy Spirit. But the way that the Holy Spirit has been presented before by religion, the way it's been shown before, portrayed before, was a little bit backwards, or at least not as refined as it is now. So now it's come to its final stage, if you will. Now it's come to it closer, at least, to the culmination of all things, and the culmination of ultimate comprehension. And so he believed that it was philosophy's job to distill many of the concepts that are shown in religion, that are shown in arts as well, into the almost like the raw logical ideas that they are, and really pull the curtain on. No more mediums, no more media of vivid imagery or stories. We're getting to the heart of the matter through philosophy. That's what philosophy should do. And of course, that's a very tall order. I've got to mention he's considered the last of the great system builders in philosophy. So he's considered as almost the last-ditch effort to try and actually construct a system that works and that you can fit the whole world into, almost sort of the thing, right? Which is almost paradoxical in a way, because at the same time he was resistant to the one-eyed way of viewing things and the way of trying to put everything into just one lens. That was what he was trying to get away from. He was trying to incorporate all the different spheres of knowledge and the world. Right, I am getting close to the ending of my time here. I will say one final thing here. Might go for... also about the individual fitting into the whole. That little last thing I'll just cover here. He had this notion that each individual human has a bit of the key to the absolute in them. So each person carries a little bit of the whole in them, right? But quite often they can't see, most of the time they can't see the whole picture, right? So the whole stage of the Geist and the collective spirit evolving, it does that through individual spirits that keep replacing each other, but every time they do, and individual spirits or individual Geists, you could call that subjects, subjectivity, people, the way people see themselves and experience the world. Each time it happens, they get slightly more and more refined. As long as they're able to look back into history, that's also an important key component, because he was very much a historian at the same time. As long as they're able to look back in history and learn from both the mistakes but also the achievements of various epochs and draw that into them, that's when they'll keep advancing humanity, right? Because then we get the best of our ancestors, if you will, and carry on into the future with that. Because if you forget that, then you're gonna have different blind spots that your ancestors might not have had, if you will. So there's something to be learned from every epoch. It's also part of one of the questions here. So rather than see the medieval times as just a period of savage warriors killing each other over land most of the time, you can actually draw out some things from medieval times that are very useful, that might have been lost today. You could take an example as honor, or the sense of honor. Maybe that is actually something that we've forgotten and something that could be revived. Or the sense of faith, you could say. He does characterize his age, and you could argue the age after, as a bit of a spiritless age. The downside of enlightenment is that it makes people parched for spirituality or sense of belonging to a bigger whole. It makes them fragmented, alienated, and that's why he started seeing, well, he's also criticizing many of these quack solutions to try and bring that out. And if he was around today, he would probably be pretty scathing of New Age spiritualism and meditation practices and things like that, just to, you know, get a grip of yourself, or just to feel a little bit better anyway. He would probably be a little bit dismissive of that, or at least saying that they're underserving what purpose they should serve. They're not really getting in deep enough. But they are a symptom of a populace and a people that are thirsty for meaning and thirsty for some kind of faith they can cling to. Now, I have spent most of my time here, so now I'm gonna open the floor a little bit for comments, questions, and the like, and then we will go out to these questions here and divide people out into groups. So I've got various questions that you can peruse, and remember the thesis is the bit in normal writing. The antithesis, the red, if you align more with that, would be the cursive writing. So if you pick a pen and a little slip for yourselves here, then you can write a little phrase of what it is that you agree with largely on that sentiment, or what your own sentiment is in comparison to that question. But let's just open up a little bit and get a few comments and questions here before we move on. We'll see how much I can help with it. Yeah?
I differ in my interpretation to you in a couple of small ways.
Sure.
Firstly, I think Hegel did think that history had reached its apotheosis in his understanding.
Yeah, I hear people say that, yeah.
And following from that, you had like two kinds of followers, the left and right Hegelians. So the right, or old Hegelians, agreed, I guess, the Prussian state is the best state there could possibly be, because Germany hadn't been invented yet. And the left Hegelians, leaders of people like Feuerbach, who influenced Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Marx quite famously. The other thing I'd say about the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it's not so much emerging as a transcendence, is what I would say. So the synthesis is a transcendence, something that couldn't be imagined before. And part of the reason why Hegel, and you can say the same about Kant, why these people are so difficult to read, why their writing is so difficult, is they are trying to think of new thought. So they are inventing that language. So people who've gone back and read it, you can have people who go back and read it and give a much more clear explanation, but that's only because we've had 200 years to get into it.
Of course, yeah. Well, I agree with a lot of that, actually. Yeah.
Excuse me. So what's the difference between, you say, the left and the right?
It's one of my favorites. I thought about adapting a couple of songs. You remember David Bowie's Young Americans? She was a young Hegelian. But the young Hegelians, so the most important one was Feuerbach. And Feuerbach was very critical of religious thought. And Feuerbach greatly influenced Marx, influenced the Russian nihilists, who influenced Nietzsche, and I believe your friend Kierkegaard read Feuerbach and so on. So the left Hegelians eventually led to Marx. The right Hegelians are your right wing, that's where you're left and right. So young Hegelians, left Hegelians eventually become materialists. And your thing about blah blah accept or reject, effectively Marx accepted something like 90% of Hegel and just changed one thing, which was, instead of ideas being the thing that propel the world, for Marx it's the material. Just to remind me, the other thing you talked about, the kind of the thing between empiricism and rationalism, Hegel more or less did away with empiricism. So Hegel is a transcendental idealist.
Yes, mate, yeah.
So in other words, if we can't know about the world, let's just forget that. What's important is the development of consciousness. I'm translating Geist as consciousness. Yeah. So it's like our individual consciousness, part of a greater consciousness that develops through history. Some people think it reached its conclusion in Hegel's writings, others think it continues.
Yeah, that's painting him much more as less of an, less of an empiricist and more of a in his head sort of fellow.
Well,
I think just going on that
Sorry,
there,
yeah.
I think the way I've interpreted him so far is yes, he's mostly over on that camp, but he did wanted to open up the divide, the complete separation between them. He did want to bridge that more, right? Because he was getting it, marching into an empirical time and in a time ruled by that. So he needed philosophy to be able to work in almost the same sphere as science, or being relatable to the world and actually get out there in the world, right?
I think he's left that debate behind. I think his dialectical reasoning is something different from the rationality of Hegel.
Yeah, I think he was it's something to describe Kant. I mean, Kant wanted to found science on the categories of the understanding, which couldn't be doubted. So you'd have a necessary foundation for science in the categories. Hegel, I mean, maybe the earliest works of Hegel, I don't know. But by the end, I think he was more, I mean, he would want to say, blah, 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 but I would say delusional, schizophrenic, more, all that. I mean, I just don't see quite the interest in science. I mean, I'm maybe not enough familiar, but I don't see necessarily the interest in science.
Okay, I think that's pretty wrong.
Right.
I mean, if you look at it, you start seeing how much he's emphasizing that philosophy needs to be a science, and philosophy actually, but here's an important caveat: we ain't understanding science more as a hard science. He called it what's it called? Wissenschaft. I forget the name. Wissenschaft.
Yeah.
So it's more of a knowledge is how I would translate it, right? But it needs to be certain of itself, and it needs to have a stronger foundation as the hard sciences, but maybe definitely a different. It can't have the same foundation as something like physics or something like that. Of course not. But it needs to be it needs to be more than just a love of learning and espousing things, and actually be able to say something about the world.
So I think the issue then is my using the word science. I mean the modern sense of science, which is not concerned with certain foundations. Almost the opposite. Physics is not certain. It's not concerned with certain foundations.
How is it not that? That does not make sense.
The point at which science is most knowledge conducive is the point at which most people are most uncertain about things. In other words.
Okay, I see. So
it's
okay. So that's a bit of a simplification, but basically, so it needs to be able to break its own paradigms. That's what you get.
Yeah, but also it's just not certain. I mean, this philosophical approach, which you call in system building, where you recurse all the way down to like foundational axioms.
Yeah.
You say, look, the world is like this, and therefore this, and you keep building up from away from bottom. I think that's a philosophical obsession. No scientist is obsessed with that. Quite the opposite. You start with data, and you make inferences and so on. Now you are right in the old German sense of science. He wanted philosophy to be a science. He wanted to be systematic. He wanted to build from foundations. He wanted to build this. This is true. But I would say that in our modern understanding of the role of philosophy, the role of science, and so on, that I would say that Hegel was not particularly concerned with what in modern words we call science. Whereas Kant, for example, was very much in the modern sense of the word science. As in, Kant really thought that if you wanted to do empirical work, you needed to have a rational foundation. I don't really think Hegel cared that much about the empirical work. I might be wrong about that, we can disagree.
I think you getting the gist of it. I think there are things that are right there. Again, I'm not a Hegelian expert, so I will preface that. But from the bit I've read, and from the bit I seem to understand here, is that he was not interested in making philosophy a hard science.
Yes,
definitely agree with that. Definitely agree with that. But he still wanted it to make itself as
systematic.
Yeah, as systematic as many other sciences were of the day, and be able to stand by what it says and not just go willy-nilly. Well, you think this, I think that. So that was quite important to him, and in that sense, bring it to some more respectability.
You're contrasting like the Socratic Gargantua people with the systematic go and found reason, right, which is Plato versus Socrates again, right? And you're saying Hegel's more of a methodological Platonist. He thinks you should have dogmas and foundations, which is correct. But there are still debates within that side of exactly how one does that. And what I'm saying is you're quite right that he's on that side of the field. He's not a reformer like Nietzsche. But within that game, are you a person who's going to start from these kind of, oh, everything needs to be certain, we're building, like a Descartes kind of, we need to go into our meditation and discover, or are you a person who's going to say, well, we can't really prove anything, here's a few axioms, just go out there and start, discovering things. That's quite a different thing. That's much more modern. And I would say that people like Kant sit somewhere in between, probably. But many of these people, including Berkeley, the origin of their worries were scientific in modern sense worries. Like Berkeley was concerned with vision and many other things. So anyway, we're rambling on about it. But
No. You bring out some valid points, and definitely, I mean, I think it's important to see exactly Kant's project as that, trying to actually make some clear lines between, say, hard science and philosophy, and make some distinctions between which rules do they operate by, but then in a way put philosophy as the progenitor of science in that way. So that's a very valid point. Exactly. No, he wanted to remove that dividing line, and in that sense, I think he was quite interested in actually merging philosophy more with, let's call it a broad term of science, or at least merge philosophy more with the world, and so it's able to impact the world more. Yeah, but it's right. You're right. Let's just clarify that, and it's actually a good clarification. He didn't necessarily want to make philosophy operate on the same rules like physics or something like that. That's a pretty important distinction. So thanks for that.
Can you elaborate on this substance of the spirit? So,
I'm not sure I can.
Spirit, does it have feelings? Does it have an agency? Or is it just a process?
Oh, the Geist. Okay. So I mean, in a sense, I suppose it does. It's almost talked like as one entity in a way, right? But of course, it's operating in a different way than each individual person, But it's the way I understand it, and feel free if someone can jump in here and come with their own comments. The way I understand it is the Geist is because it's got those religious foundations. It's almost an entity, or I'm tempted to call it like a metaphysical creature in and of itself that's driving towards somewhere and going towards somewhere in the act of knowing itself and maturing. It plays around with, I'm saying it a little bit jovial, it's playing around with us like pinballs back and forth and trying to get to a better understanding of itself.
Is that when you say it's going towards somewhere, is it going in a particular direction?
Well,
or is it going towards a specific destination? Is there a specific end goal or is it going?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, according to him, at least, it is going to the absolute, or it's going to complete knowing of itself and the world. So in that way,
but there are things that have happened since Hegel, like Gödel, that we know that.
Nothing important.
That's not really nothing important.
A few experiments with democracy, nothing else.
You mentioned honoculture. Maybe it's outgrowing honoculture, because I think Hegel did say that we transcended the other culture, which is in certain parts, so we're still happy in certain parts of the Middle East.
Right. And you might say that, there's many problems with honoculture, right? And if you want to be generous to it, you could say, well, we can pick out the things that work from that and try and incorporate it into a new world. Or you could take the opinion, and that's actually almost leading into this exercise here. You could take the opinion and say, no, the only thing we can learn from the past is really the failures of the past, because my God, there were a lot of failures, and these things are a little bit better now, And that would be, as I understand, going a bit away from Hegel's project, or at least being slightly more critical of history than he would be. But he also has that lens. He's also aware that history is messy and leads to many problems, right? And it's not perfect. It's not a perfect evolution. We've heard you. I just want to check if there's anyone else who want to jump the gun here. Yes, Will. Oh, sorry. I'll get you as well. So I'll get you. So let's hear.
So this is more of a personal clarification.
Sure.
Could you explain the difference between, is it rationalism and empiricism? So I'm not entirely clear.
Okay, so we've been getting into that a bit before. We've been getting into that a couple of sessions before. The main difference, I'm really boiling it down now, but a good way of thinking of it that I like to grasp occasionally is empiricism. You're mostly concerned with the outside world, and you actually try and explain a lot of the inner workings of the subject of you in form of the outside world. So
Nowadays, an empiricist might look like, well, the reason you have these thoughts and the reason you think these is because of your particular biological chemistry. It's also because of the environment that you grew up in that's affecting you in a particular way. So you've had these outside forces pushing on you. At the same time, you have these biological inclinations, and that is culminated in you. That could be a typical empiricist way of presenting the subject, in a way, right? But quite often, the weakness of that, and what rationalism can sort of point out, is it doesn't really get to the core of my experience as me, necessarily, right? It doesn't actually tell me what the hell I am. I'm this self-agency thing that can make decisions, that can decide to do weird motions if I feel like it, I seem to have a will of my own. And so the rationalists, they start seeing that almost the internal world almost as more real than the outside world, because you can't trust your senses, right? Quite often you're duped by what you see. Quite often you get the wrong impression, you get the wrong idea. So actually they would call, they're going sort of a little bit the opposite direction, you might say, and saying, I'm going to start shutting out the world and dive deeper into myself and figure out what's true first here, and then I can work my way out from there. That was, for example, Descartes' project. That was like, assume that everything is wrong. He uses a methodological doubt, right? He assumes nothing is true, it's all an illusion. I'm in the Matrix, right? What could I find out as a true foundational ground if I was living, say, in Neo's Matrix? What's the only thing that's true there? Well, the only thing that's true about this simulacrum of the world is that I'm a thinking being, even though I'm trapped in illusion, sort of thing, right? Quick breakdown there. But that's sort of the two camps there, if you will. And a lot of modern philosophy has been oscillating between that. Hegel might even say it's been going thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's been a dialectic process between those two forces. Could be, yeah. I've not heard. Oh, sorry, I promised to go over again. Yeah.
So, from my understanding, Marx's idea about human position is divided into the first stage from the slave society to feudal society to capitalism society. Each stage you can have a symbol that tools as a symbol to divide the different society.
Yeah.
So this is the evolution of human society. So about Hegel's idea about the evolution of society, he divided it into different stages. What he said, these different stages symbol as we said, like the religion or environment and the Renaissance. Provided the evidence as like Marx used very solid materialist substance to establish each stage of society.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he definitely does get into that whole dynamic. He talks about the master-slave relationship almost like a dialectic, a dichotomy in itself, right? So he does get into that, and sort of the gradual development of society through sometimes slaves becoming aware of their condition and refusing to be in that role, or accepting to be in that role with new knowledge that they are masters of other things below them, sort of thing. See, this well, how does he argue for that? I think he bases it very much, I'm tempted to say it's getting close to the thrust of Marxists' argument as well, by looking back at history and then what's the word? Comprehending by looking back at those events and then generating meaning from that. He's got one famous quote where he'll say, what the wings of Minerva's owl only spread at the fall of dusk, right? So we always have to look back with hindsight. And that's why history is key, because history can tell us where we're going, but we can usually only learn about 100 years later, sort of thing. But if his main argument, you were kind of asking for what's his proof, in a way. Is that what I'm hearing? What's his evidence for these things? Well, I think mostly his evidence is pointing back into history and see how history has developed and where we are now, and see how far we've come from these basically slave-based societies to much more equal this is where I need to do some more reading to be able to give you some really more confident answers of what Hegel would say. But that's my understanding of Hegel so far, that would be his main proof, history itself. And then sort of putting that into a whole and showing how it's led to here, you know. Yeah, that's my best answer there. Yeah?
It seems to me that he's what was done is part of common sense, and there's not have a combination of reality made of reason, I get the impression. But if that's the case, anathemas are still pondering the religious element to all this. Is that because it's laziness, or insidious, or self-serving? There's no flat-out axioms.
Not the way I see him, no. I think he, of course, he grew up with religious foundations, right? That was part of his upbringing, it's part of what he believed in as well, and...
I suppose that's laziness.
Well, I'm not sure I would go as far as saying that, but